Hi there, welcome back to 19th Century Art. In the next 3 lectures, we're going to be examining the arts and crafts movement and how it came to influence the art of Europe and the United States. This movement was chiefly inspired by art in Japan. And so in this first lecture, I want to go and look at the kind of art that was being made in Japan and how it would eventually arrive in the US and Europe and inspire so much change. To begin with, we have to go back to the Edo period, which is in the 16th century. At the time, the feudal lords came into contact with Europe for the first time, and cannons and musket fire were introduced. A massive change occurred in the feudal system of Japan, and a whole new feudal lord came into power during this period. In the early period, they began building these spectacular castles. One of the few surviving is the Himeji Castle near Osaka. And this is part of this extraordinary transformation that is happening in Japan at this time. As Japan was opened to the Portuguese initially, they began to proselytize in Japan with Christianity. And the shogunate, the feudal lords who were in charge of Japan, were intimidated by the growing strength of this new religion in their territory. And there was a Shimabara rebellion where the Christians tried to fight back against the oppression of the feudal lords. The rebellion was brutally suppressed, and from 1639 all the way until the 19th century, Japan kicked out all foreigners and Christianity was outlawed. The main thing we need to know about this Edo period was the society was divided really into 3 classes. There was the emperor's court, where the emperor had a ceremonial role in maintaining the Shinto traditions of the past. And then there was the samurai court, where you had a military-based feudal system that really ran the country, collected taxes, policed, and did all the important business that kept everything running. Each of these courts had its own artistic traditions. The emperor's court was primarily represented by what would be called the Tosa school, where you see this very colorful, elegant views of life at court, and this peering down into a misty scene full of beautiful gardens and elegant courtiers. And then the samurai court, which was heavily influenced by Chinese painting, very monochromatic or limited color range, and they liked really striking, bold nature scenes that were very clearly defined landscapes. And so the samurai's court was the one that really had the purse strings, the ones that were really very influential because they were the ones who had all the actual power in Japan at this time. During the Edo period, a whole new class of people began to emerge, the merchant class. And as the Edo period grew in stability, the merchants prospered. And the merchants had their own tastes and ideas about art. Here's an example of some of the new artistic style that was emerging at this time. Towaria Sotatsu was an artist who began exploring with some of the poetic themes from the Tosa school, the emperor's court, but introducing them into landscapes and other forms and patterning that was very reminiscent of the Kano school. It's kind of a fusion of these 2 artistic traditions, and this really appealed to this new merchant class. Now, this is a folding screen, and so when we look at this series of panels, we have to remember that they would actually be seen in a sort of corrugated way, and they were very practical. They could fold up very neatly, but it allowed for people to make partitions and have some privacy in these large rooms. So folding screens were often shifted and changed according to the seasons. And so in this folding screen, we see all this individual fans painted in the natural ways of the Kano school of the samurai court. Now, the style was really brought into focus by the artist Ogata Korin, and it would later be called after him Rimpa. And Rimpa means the school of Ogata Korin, and it wasn't actually a school. It really was an artistic style. He was more like a designer. He would work with craftsmen. He would have ideas about making fine artisanal objects for the merchant class, and they would be designed to appeal to this new sensibility. And so the Rimpa style is really this wonderful, inventive fusion of these two older traditions. We see here Ogata Korin just boldly painting this landscape with this bright swash of gold and the swirling waters of the river and these just beautiful explosions of plum blossoms. Another example of a Rimpa object, this is now a lacquer box, and they would take their ideas and they would apply them to all kinds of different household objects and folding screens and calligraphy. The Rimpa style was really, as I said, like designers. They could take their ways of making images and ideas and apply them to a whole range of different kinds of objects. Whereas in a traditional school, the artisan would have been focused on a single kind of object. Now, one of the art styles that was becoming very popular with the merchant class, these new multicolored woodblock prints that celebrated various scenes from around Japan. When the foreigners were kicked out, the Japanese were not allowed to travel outside their country. So inside Japan, there was a bustling business of travel and seeing the sights within Japan. And so these pictures of famous views of Mount Fuji were very popular because of the way people associated their memories and associations with the landscape, which they hold so dear. So this is a very famous picture by the extraordinary artist Katsushika Hokusai. If you've seen any art from Japan, I'm sure you've seen this before. It's a spectacular giant wave off Kanagawa, a place known for its giant waves. The boats are cutting through the water, and Mount Fuji prominently featured in the back, looking like another wave along the sea. And so this was what was so fun and exciting about these new woodblock prints, is that they were appealing to new tastes and the merchant class, the people who were not quite rich enough to afford an original work of art, but were snapping up these prints. Now, Hokusai had a really tremendous amount of energy, and he was actually made quite a bit of money, not from his prints, but from his students. And so to encourage people to become his student, he created these sketchbooks that were things in Japanese life that he was showing how to draw. And they could be botanical images, they could be mythical images, they could be acrobats in various poses. And it was all intended in these booklets to teach people how to draw. So Hokusai called these books Hokusai manga. And it must be said that these are not actual manga as we think of manga today, comic books. The word manga here merely means irresponsible pictures. And while he popularized the word manga from these publications, he didn't actually make stories in pictures like we associate with manga today. Now, and I said all the foreigners had been kicked out, all of them except the Dutch. Now, the Portuguese, for their part in promoting Christianity, were not allowed back in. But the Dutch, because they helped the shogunate defeat the Portuguese, they were allowed to stay on a small island of Dijima off the coast of Nagasaki. And there they strictly held to trading a few essential things that the shogunate could not get within their country. So this exclusive trading deal was very favorable to the Dutch, but they were very strict about keeping them to this tiny island. They weren't allowed to move into the interior of the Japanese court. Here we see the VOC, as it became known as the Dutch East India Company, which had colonial holdings in Java and South Africa and a few other places as well. And in Japan, they were required, like all the feudal lords, to travel into the interior and pay their respects to the shogun every year. And this is an etching of that journey in 1727. So in a limited way, people of Japan had only a small access to the art styles of the West, and they were fascinated by these traditions in the Dutch art making that they had never seen before, this idea of a still life. And we see Utagawa Toyoharu here trying to master the perspective of cups and bowls. The idea of perspective was something that was completely new to the Japanese. The Chinese did not develop perspective in that way that it had appeared in Italy during the Renaissance. And so by going to Dejima, artisans were trying to get access to Dutch works of art that they could then use to learn some of these new visual tricks. So here we see Utagawa Toyoharu's view from the Forum in Rome. And this is an extraordinary image because it shows you an etching in perspective that has been translated into a woodblock print by Utagawa Toyoharu. And this kind of design, we've seen these before. If you remember the Grand Tour, people would come back and have these paintings made of all the famous monuments in Rome. And there's no actual one place where all these monuments conveniently line up so that one person can paint them all at once. This is a combination of all kinds of important things. The column of Trajan and the Colosseum and various other important artifacts of Rome are all being pictured in an arbitrary way. You can see how they're mixed up in the difference between this painting by Giovanni Paolo Panini and Utagawa Toyoharu's composition. So we call this new pictures in Japan that use perspective Ukiyoe, okay? Floating pictures, all right? The floating pictures. And these are perspective prints because when you look at them, it feels like you're sort of floating off the ground. And this is a kind of a fascinating thing. And for the Japanese, this was a new visual trick. It wasn't like, oh, wow, we've been doing this wrong all these years, and now we have to do and use perspective to make our pictures more real. No, it's more like, oh, this looks kind of interesting. Let's try this. This is exotic. This is different. Let's just try it and mix it up with other things we're already doing. Because the Europeans were not allowed, there were strict rules about allowing the translation of foreign books and all this. This was really revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. This was the motto of the samurai class. Their whole legitimacy was that they were the defenders of Japan. And they had this very strict seclusion policy, sokoku policy, that really was about defending the nation against the incursion of foreigners. This all comes to a crashing end in 1853 when the American Commodore Matthew Perry arrives in Japan, and he basically tells the Japanese, we need to trade with you. Your port is too valuable for us. If we have ships and they're sailing all the way from Hawaii to China, they need to stop in Japan. And so they basically demanded that Japan open up or face serious consequences. And so it was either open up or we're just going to march in and take over. So this was the arrival of the black ships. This is a very important pivotal moment in Japanese history. The black ships were steam-powered vessels that had extraordinary cannons. They so far outstripped anything in Japan that they really had to just beg for mercy and accept any terms the Americans offered. Now, at this time, at age 14, the artist Ukiyoe Yoshitoshi was there when the black ships arrive. And it's the same year when he would create his first woodblock print for sale. He'd become a very celebrated woodblock print artist. This is a much later print where he's recalling what it was like to see these massive boats arrive in the harbor. And so when you see the way we are meant to read this picture from right to left, it feels like this grand migration toward the black ships, this powerful presence hanging on the horizon. Yoshitoshi was an extraordinary artist, and he used a lot of attention to naturalistic detail, which he picked up from looking at European magazines. So you can see a number of the characteristic qualities of this print is that it's already influenced by European patterns and designs and filigrees. It's dropping away all the elements of the traditional Japanese borders, including these new kinds of things. They're also, because of the trade with West, they're now using these new colors. Bright purple and green and yellows. And these are all new aniline dyes or chemical dyes that were unheard of before the arrival of the Europeans. With the arrival of the Europeans, they came, they settled, they were absolutely enthralled by what they found in Japan. Charles Wigman was hired to be a reporter for a magazine in Britain. He arrived in Japan. He immediately quit his job at the British magazine and began to create his own magazine in Japan for all the expats there. And he called it the Japan Punch, named after that magazine we were just talking about that was so popular in Great Britain. And so the Japan Punch was the very first time the Japanese got to see this American idea of humor in pictures, these ideas of caricature and ideas of comic drawings that had captions and humorous actions, these satirical prints. And so for many years, the word for cartoons and comics in Japan was punchii, punch pictures. For everyone associated them with Charles Wigman's The Japan Punch, as he was to them the progenitor of the Western comic in Japan. So one of the extraordinary traditions of the Edo Japan was the tradition of kabuki. And in kabuki, this very spectacular theater with very large costumes and a very dramatic runway through the auditorium. And this was a theater that the Westerners were truly fascinated by. It was so bold, it was so theatrical, it was so over the top. Here's a woodblock print by Utagawa Toyokuni III, and it shows the actor Ichikawa Danjiro on the Hanamichi, the flower path, right, going through the auditorium. He's right there in the audience showing off his big acting in this a live drama. Now, compare this picture of the traditional Japanese kabuki with this picture here, now 3 years later. And what we see here is we have foreigners in the audience. They're all sitting in their Western chairs. They're not sitting on the floor. And the curious thing about this is that we're now seeing for the first time how the foreigners see the theater. Notice now on stage there are these figures in black who are holding poles with plates on the end with candles. And this is how they illuminated the scene. And these had been in the kabuki theater for a long time. But this is the first time I've ever seen a print representing the kabuki stage, where you actually see these stage assistants. Typically, they're just not included in the frame, even though they would have been there visible in the actual performance. So I think there's a kind of self-consciousness that's happening, that's creeping into these traditional arts. They're beginning to see the way the Europeans see their own theater, and they're very self-conscious about it, to say the least. Now, kabuki had always been, throughout the Edo period, the latest fashion. It represented the cutting edge of what the audience expected to see in the most beautiful clothing, the most elegant language, the most stylish gestures and movement. And kabuki really prided itself on being that kind of role model for the present society. So one of the things that came up with these new tastes in Western clothes, how can kabuki adapt? So they tried this new cropped hair kabuki, zangerimono. And this was a story, and it was based on a news story about strange tale of castaways, a Western kabuki. Toyohara Kunichika in 1879 created this print celebrating this performance. You can see the aniline dyes, this very vivid, rich, the Western style clothing. They're sitting in chairs. There's still very dramatic and stylized faces and gestures, but it's trying to capture the fascination with the West and bring it into kabuki so it can remain relevant. Well, this was a catastrophic failure. The audiences booed, they hissed, they laughed, they thought it was ridiculous. And so it really was this break at this point. Kabuki, from this time forward, would retreat back into the artistic tastes of the Edo period. And there would not be a modern theater emerging from kabuki. Kabuki would always be this traditional theater form, just as it is today. Now, believe me, kabuki has continued to grow and change in other ways, but its heart and soul and aesthetic tastes are still deeply rooted in this period of the Edo and the sort of the artistic style and taste that were cultivated at that time. Artists were struggling with an identity. Yoshitoshi, who had early on embraced Western designs and Western traditions in illustration, began toward the end of his life to go back and explore some of the ancient stories in this series of beautiful prints, which he calls New Forms of 36 Ghosts. Now, ghosts have been a very popular topic in Japan, especially in the late Edo period. But notice how he treats this subject. He introduces this really elegant print with this very rough, ragged edge, like we have a picture here that is actually fading and decaying before our very eyes. Its elegance and its freshness and its beauty is from a bygone age. And this is a really telling detail, the way he framed each and every one of these 36 ghosts with this very curious, torn, ragged edge. Furthermore, he really doubles down on the woodblock print. I had a chance to actually see this print, and you get up close to it, and what looks like a plain white sleeve is actually embossed with this incredible pattern. You can sort of barely make it out here in this close-up. But the idea was he was going to create a woodblock print that could only exist as a woodblock print, to really celebrate the style and the techniques and the artistry that made the woodblock printing so famous. And so it's sort of an attempt, a desperate attempt really, to try and hold on to the past and give that past some meaning. At the time, many artists were frankly embarrassed by how backward their country was and how little they had to show for themselves in the modern world, and how desperately they needed to modernize their country. And so many of them began to study Western style painting. The Italian painter Antonio Fontanesi came to Japan and began teaching people in this more conservative Barbizon school of French landscape painting. And so the Technical Art School was founded in 1876, And you can see this attempt to, really look at Japan, not color it in fancy ways or decorate it in the ways of the past, but try and adopt this very rational and very sensible, realistic approach to landscape. And this Western style painting would be called yoga, Yo Western, Ga pictures.